Ancient Aliens is an American television series which premiered on April 20th, 2010 on the History Channel. The program presents the so-called ancient astronaut theory, which is the idea that extraterrestrials visited the Earth in the ancient past, and that historical texts, archaeological records, and various legends contain evidence of this contact. I used to believe that the ancient astronaut theory was true. I spent years learning about it from the popular authors, from video presentations and radio shows. I was an enthusiastic promoter of this idea to my friends and family. Although I no longer feel that way, I want you to know that I have no personal reasons to reject this theory. My current worldview could easily accommodate the existence of extraterrestrials. I hope you will come away from this film, even if you disagree with it, saying that I fairly reviewed the claims of ancient aliens without bias and with respect. I hope to show you that this is not a matter of ancient aliens getting a few details wrong here and there and their main premise remaining true. That is not an option in my opinion. I hope to demonstrate to you that they are wrong not on some, but on every single point where they assert an ancient astronaut theory to explain evidence, and that often they are using deceptive means to do this, and sometimes even fabricating evidence to make their points, as we will see. I would also like the viewer to know that unlike many skeptics of the ancient astronaut theory, I actually concede that something out of the ordinary could have occurred in the ancient past, and that there are certain consistent themes in ancient mythologies and the like that require good explanations. But I think you will quickly see that the ancient astronaut theories do not explain this evidence. You will notice a number that appears periodically on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen throughout this film. This number will appear when I am making a claim that requires a reference in order to back it up, and it will correspond to a number on the companion website ancientaliensdebunked.com. This film is divided into 3 main sections, and each topic can be viewed independently at the website if you choose. I will occasionally be joined by commentary from Dr. Michael Heiser, one of the few actual scholars who has been willing to interact with the ancient astronaut theory. Dr. Heiser has been one of the most articulate proponents of the skeptical viewpoint of this theory, and has written papers and books, as well as almost a dozen websites on the issues we will be covering in this film. We are happy to have him as a part of this film, and we're happy to have you, the viewer, here as well. I encourage you to have an open mind and enjoy the film.
All throughout the Middle Ages, there are some magnificent paintings, and in certain areas of the painting there are what looks like to be UFOs. They're always floating up in the sky, usually above the Virgin Mary or above Jesus on the crucifix, or somewhere we have sceneries that depict what looks like UFOs.
Almost all supposed UFO and art cases come from medieval art, and there's a pretty good reason for that. Most people are not aware of the symbolism rules of Byzantine or medieval art, and so they're easy prey for ancient astronaut theories about it. This theory concerning Byzantine art could never work on someone who studies this type of art professionally. Let me show you why. First, let's take one that Ancient Aliens showed in the background a few times in that last clip. It's a very famous UFO and art painting, and it usually is presented using a very poor quality image, so you can't see the details very well. If you look closely, you can see these objects have distinct faces. They are actually representing the sun and the moon, and you would think that someone being honest about this would fill you in that they appear in almost every painting of a crucifixion done in the Byzantine style. The sun and the moon were consistently depicted with human characteristics. Sometimes they had just faces, other times they had full bodies. The concept of representing the sun and the moon with human characteristics was a carryover from the pagan artwork of Rome. The Roman Catholic Church simply continued the tradition of representing the sun and the moon with human characteristics in the artwork that it had commissioned. The sun and the moon are usually facing the cross, which is supposed to represent them being witnesses to the crucifixion. The sheer number of Byzantine crucifixion scenes where these objects are depicted in such a way that is obviously supposed to be the sun and the moon should be enough to put this one to rest for good. Ancient Aliens goes on for a while about the 14th century fresco at the Viskovsky Dekani Monastery in Kosovo. This one has been a big favorite of the ancient astronaut theorists since it first appeared in a French magazine called Sputnik in the 1960s. This crucifixion scene is just like all the others we have seen, except it has a more full-body representation of the sun and the moon. There are just as many examples of the sun and the moon being depicted in this way, with full bodies, in other Byzantine crucifixion scenes, including in other places in this same monastery. Ancient Aliens also shows this famous painting. Well, famous to ancient astronaut theorists anyway. This one is like all the others, in that once you know what you're looking at, you will see so many other examples of it in medieval art. This one is called Madonna with Child with the Infant St. John. And to start out, I want to draw your attention just below, to the right of the object, where you will see a character holding his hand to his eyes and looking toward the sky. With him is a dog that is also looking towards the sky. The painting was supposed to be depicting this passage in the Bible. And there were in the same country shepherds abiding in the field, keeping watch over their flock by night. And lo, an angel of the Lord come upon them. And the glory of the Lord shone round about them. And they were sore afraid. And the angel said to them, Fear ye not, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which shall be to all people. For unto you was born this day in the city of David a Saviour, which is Christ the Lord. So the shepherds and the glory of the Lord shining round about them are all in the context of the announcement of Jesus' birth from the Gospel of Luke. What really demystifies this is to show other paintings from the era depicting the same scene. Slowly, you will see what the so-called UFO is supposed to be. First of all, you will notice that all of these paintings have the same shepherd, usually with a dog, and usually with their hands to their eyes. Usually, an angel comes out of the cloud lined with light. In older pictures, the cloud in the scene would have had golden rays. Sometimes an angel is coming out of a big tear in the sky. Other times, like this one of a similar style, only the tear in the sky is visible, not the angel. In almost an identical tondo, we see the shepherd looking toward a red-dressed angel, and in the center, above the Madonna's head, there is the same light-rayed cloud. Here is the same scene painted by the artist's brother-in-law, with a bright star appearing inside a cloud. On a hill to the right, the angel appears to the shepherds. Here is another shepherd scene. We see the angel and the luminous cloud. Sometimes the angels would be depicted in the cloud like this. So, the Madonna with Child with the Infant St. John can safely be identified with the announcement scene in the Gospel of Luke, and all the elements in the painting are well known by students of medieval art.
The most famous painting, that without any doubt in my mind, depicts a UFO with its laser beam, was made by Crivelli in 1486. The Annunciation to Mary.
In medieval art, in the Annunciation, when Mary is told that she will have a child, but she will still be a virgin, and the angels tell her this, over Mary's head is a space capsule. But what's a UFO or a space capsule doing over Mary?
This isn't a space capsule. If you look closely, you will see that it is formed by a circle of clouds inside of which there are two circles of small angels. This is a very common way of representing God, visible in a huge number of paintings. Gustave Doré, in the middle of the 1800s, even resumed this pattern of the circles of angels in his illustration titled Dante's Paradise. The so-called laser beam is present in a lot of paintings of this scene, and is used to show the impregnation of Mary by the Holy Spirit, often represented by a dove, which is present in this painting as well if you look closely. But this laser beam loses its value for the ancient astronaut theorist the more one sees of other paintings of this biblical scene, because it becomes obvious that they weren't trying to depict a space capsule at all, but rather the circle of angels motif. The last one Ancient Aliens mentions is this one.
One very interesting painting is where Jesus sits up in the clouds with quote-unquote God, and they're holding on to the antenna of what looks like Sputnik. And theologians say what is depicted here is nothing else but the Earth. But why would Earth have two antennae sticking out of it? And why would it be round? Because the mainstream viewpoint at the time was that the Earth was flat.
This is similar to all the others we have looked at, in that there are lots of other pictures of this biblical scene that help to give us context. The scene usually contains the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, usually symbolized as a dove, and they're holding what is sometimes called the creation globe. The idea that they're trying to convey is the biblical concept that the creation of the world is attributed to the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. This creation globe becomes a very common symbol in medieval art. And the only reason Ancient Aliens says it can't represent a globe is that, according to them, people at that time in history thought the Earth was flat. Although this idea about people in the Middle Ages believing that the Earth was flat is widely believed nowadays, it's little better than an urban legend. If you type in the myth of the flat Earth into a search engine, you'll see that the truth is that almost every scientist since the ancient Greeks knew the Earth was spherical. Here are a few quotes about this. Historian Jeffrey Burton Russell says the flat Earth error flourished most between 1870 and 1920. He said, quote, "With extraordinarily few exceptions, no educated person in the history of Western civilization from the 3rd century BC onward believed that the Earth was flat." He continues, quote, "The myth that people in the Middle Ages thought that the Earth was flat appears to date from the 17th century as part of the campaign by Protestants against Catholic teaching. But it gained currency in the 19th century thanks to inaccurate histories such as John William Draper's History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, and Andrew Dixon White's History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. Atheists and agnostics championed the conflict thesis for their own purposes. But historical research gradually demonstrated that Draper and White had propagated more fantasy than fact in their efforts to prove that science and religion are locked in eternal conflict. One funny thing about this is that Tsoukalos, in another episode of Ancient Aliens, in order to suit his purposes there, admits the idea of a round Earth was even in the Bible.
Moses actually describes Earth seen from outer space. The quote is, "Thereupon I saw the whole round of the earth, at once the depth of the earth and the vast altitudes of the heavens." I mean, here he describes Earth as being round.
So there is no problem whatsoever with the medieval artists knowing that the Earth was round, and therefore there is no reason to say that these symbols aren't representing exactly what the artists have always said that they represent. Almost all UFO and art theories come from the Middle Ages, and they all fail when they are compared with other paintings of the same scene, because one can then see that these were consistent motifs in that style of art, and were used to describe certain theological concepts, which, when explained in light of the concept that it's obviously trying to convey, it totally demystifies the objects in question.
Puma Punku is so unique in the way that it was constructed and shaped and positioned that it is the most intriguing ancient site on the planet.
While the pyramids at Giza are incredible feat of achievement, compared to Puma Punku, the pyramids are child play. In my opinion, the most significant piece of evidence that we have in this entire ancient astronaut puzzle is Puma Punku in the highland of Bolivia.
Well, if Puma Punku is considered such good evidence for the ancient astronaut theory, we should probably start off by looking at it. After all, it's the one that they say was built directly by extraterrestrials.
Puma Punku is the only site on planet Earth that, in my opinion, was built directly by extraterrestrials.
Ancient Aliens starts off with a false dilemma by making people think that it was absolutely impossible for ancient people to construct Puma Punku, even to the point of making outright false claims.
One of the most intriguing things there is that the stones that were used there aren't sandstone, they're granite and diorite. The only stone that's harder than diorite is diamond. So the only way that this could have been achieved is if the tools were tipped with diamonds.
This is funny because it's totally wrong. The stones are not granite or diorite at Pumapunku. They are red sandstone and andesite. But this is also funny because of the way that he says it.
The stones that were used there aren't sandstone, they're granite and diorite.
Well, yeah, actually, it is sandstone. You can't blame him, though. It becomes obvious that throughout the series, he often just repeats things he's heard in Eric von Daniken's books. Von Daniken's books are what the Ancient Aliens series is based on. Later, we see Eric von Daniken himself make the exact same, totally wrong claim.
Of course made out of stones found on Earth, because you don't transport granite or diorite from another solar system.
Von Daniken continues building up this false dilemma.
One of these platforms is 800 tons.
This is very incorrect. The heaviest block at Pumapunku is 130 tons, and most of the stones are much smaller than that, so he's off by a whopping 670 tons. Unfortunately, we will come to expect this kind of thing from von Daniken as we progress. Ancient Aliens spends quite a lot of time pointing out the various features in the stonemasonry at Pumapunku, and then declaring it impossible to do without power tools.
Each of these small drill holes are basically evenly spaced along this routed groove. To me, it's clear that power tools have been used on this unusual block of stone here.
Well, exactly, and this surface is as smooth as the tabletop, like in your kitchen. There's no wave to it or anything. This was machined.
The sandstone and andesite stones at Pumapunku would have been easily worked with the most basic stoneworking tools. The idea that diamond-tipped power saws were needed is ridiculous. The red sandstone was relatively soft and easy to work with, and even though andesite is pretty hard, because of the way it cooled, it could easily be flaked off using stones as soft as 5.5 on the Mohs scale. Such pounding stones were found all over the andesite quarries in the area. Contrary to Ancient Aliens' claims that archaeologists are baffled by Pumapunku, archaeologists know the basics about how Pumapunku's stones were cut and shaped. This is partly because there is evidence for this all over the site itself. They actually used a method that almost all ancient stoneworkers used. They used hard pounding stones to pound out trough-like depressions. Later on, they used flat stones and sand to grind the stone to make a polished surface. We will see later on that this is also how the Egyptians, thousands of years before this, made their flat-surfaced granite monuments like obelisks. Sand, as we will see later when we look at Egypt, has extremely hard particles in it, and if placed between a flat surface and a rock, can polish even the hardest stones known to man. In fact, the harder the stone is, the better it can be polished using sand. We will also see how sand can turn a piece of copper into a very efficient granite saw or granite drill, a method which the Egyptians utilized quite well. Some stones at Pumapunku that Ancient Aliens would never show the cameras are the ones that are in the middle of this process. They show that at the same time a stone was being pounded by stone hammers, which created these trough-like depressions, the grinding and polishing was taking place on the other end of the stone. Unfinished stones like this one clearly show how they were shaped, and it wasn't with lasers. There's also unmistakable evidence of stone hammers having been used in places that were never meant to be visible, like where certain stones would be connected with one another. And because of that, it's hard for me to believe Eric von Daniken in this next clip, because it would mean that the alien toolbox had a laser gun right next to a stone hammer.
Extraterrestrials arrive. The spaceship stands in orbit. Only a smaller space vehicle comes down like a space shuttle. So, just to protect their instruments, they make overnight, with their technology, what we call a base camp. Of course made out of stones found on Earth, because you don't transport granite or diorite from another solar system. And then they disappear. But the wall of their base camp is still there.
It is true that stone tools would not be enough to construct Pumapunku, especially for some of the finer points. For that, they would need metal chisels and the equivalent of a carpenter's square. Entire studies have been done detailing how these cuts were made, and nothing spectacular is required except some metal tools like chisels. The arguments against this are usually either that a particular culture did not yet know how to cast metals, or that copper chisels would have been too weak. On the first point, we know that the pre-Incan Andean culture was very skilled at fashioning metals and creating metal alloys. In fact, the people who built Puma Punku were even pouring copper alloys into molds right on site, showing that they had more than enough capability to form all kinds of metal tools. But the question is, what about the tool's strength? Well, even if they were pouring pure copper into a mold, it would still work, but it would need sharpening often. But because archaeologists actually found a few of these metal cramps used by them on site, we now know that they were using a very strong copper arsenic nickel alloy, which made a much stronger final product. Arsenic acts as a deoxidant, preventing the metal from becoming too brittle, and nickel was used in copper alloys specifically to make strong chisels. Once you understand that they had the ability to make strong metal tools in a huge variety of shapes, there is no part of Puma Punku's stonework that would have been too difficult for them. Well, what about these 90-degree right angles that ancient aliens make so much about?
One of the amazing things here at Puma Punku is the precision of the blocks. You can see with this block of granite that it's really been cut at very accurate right angles.
To make flat surfaces with right angles, you don't need alien technology. You only need a square or a simple equivalent. It's important to keep in mind that Puma Punku would have been built thousands of years after the Egyptians, who had all kinds of squares and plumb bobs and levels and so on. It's a pretty basic stoneworking tool. That being said, despite what Ancient Aliens says, Puma Punku is not all perfect right angles. You can even see this, ironically enough, as the Ancient Aliens crew goes around with carpenter's squares. You can see that some of them are simply not square. Also, they make claims like all the H blocks are the same dimensions, which they say suggests that they were made by a big machine. But not only would that not be the only conclusion if it were true, it's not even true. The dimensions of the H blocks are not all the same, though they are close. It's probably the case that they were made using the same plans. Speaking of plans,
mainstream archaeologists say that Puma Punku was built by the Aymara Indians. And we would all have to agree that in order to build something like Puma Punku, you need writing, you need planning, and you need some sort of a idea where which piece goes and how it ultimately all fits together. But there is one thing that all the mainstream archaeologists agree upon, that the Aymara didn't have any writing. So how is it possible that they built all of this without plans?
the builders of Puma Punku may not have had an alphabet, but they did use the common iconography or artwork of their culture called Yanomama. All the icons on the site are Yanomama, not secret alien code, and this is but one of the many indications of the culture and time that it was built. But my point is that like many cultures, they used pictures instead of an alphabet, and most building plans are done through pictures, like blueprints for example. So saying that no alphabet means no planning is pretty ridiculous in my opinion. Well, what about moving the stones and lifting them into place? Surely that would have required levitation.
How these massive blocks of granite were moved from their quarries and brought here to Puma Punku would have required some kind of super technology. Levitation and anti-gravity. Huge lifting vehicles. Something that ancient aliens would have had.
If they did know how to levitate these stones, then they put far too much effort into creating places in the stones to attach ropes to. Many stones at Puma Punku have grooves several centimeters in width and depth on two adjacent faces for holding ropes. They even had special places cut into the stones that Puma Punku scholars call hoisting grips, all very strange things to do if they could simply levitate these blocks. And to make matters worse for the ancient astronaut theory here, according to archaeologist Jean-Pierre Pratzen, who is an expert on Puma Punku, there is almost no stone at the Puma Punku site that does not have what he calls drag marks on one of its faces, where it has been, well, dragged to the site. Ancient Aliens throws up another false dilemma here.
What nobody talks about is the irrefutable fact that we are at an altitude of 12,800 feet, which means we are above the natural tree line. No trees ever grew in that area, meaning no trees were cut down in order to use wooden rollers. The wooden roller theory falls by the wayside.
This is like saying that there's no way that the Egyptians used wood because trees didn't grow in Egypt, which is true. The difference is that while the Egyptians had to import wood from places like Lebanon, it would have been far easier for those at Pumapunku to solve this problem. All they would have had to do is simply walk down the hill a little bit. Okay, well, what about this claim?
Logic does not exist at Pumapunku because there we have megalithic structures which just lie about this entire site as if ripped apart by some sort of a great force.
I propose that logic still exists at Pumapunku, and that the scattered state of the complex can easily be explained. Quoting from archaeologist Alexei Vranich, quote, "The high quality of the stones made it attractive building material for houses, churches, plazas, bridges, even railways." In other words, the stones were pulled down and hauled off by locals for building material. In fact, we have the 400-year-old writings of a visitor to Pumapunku who said that the looting was in full swing even back then. He wrote that if the site was closer to town, he didn't think there would have been any stones left at all. Ancient Alien says that Pumapunku is 17,000 years old. This is what Vranich said of this claim. Quote, "The idea that Tiwanaku is 14,000 years old is based on a rather faulty study done in 1926. Since then, there has been a huge quantity of work, both on the archaeology and the geology of the area, and all data indicates that Tiwanaku existed from around AD 300 to 500. For more information on the faulty study he's referring to here, I will quote at length from Jason Colavito, who has been debunking ancient astronaut theories for years in his books and blogs. He said the following about this claim. Quote, "Tiwanaku is not 17,000 years old. This date derives from the work of Arthur Poznański, who tried to apply archaeoastronomy to the site, but did so in ways that modern scholars do not recognize as legitimate. Poznański proposed a date of 15,000 BP, before present, i.e. 13,000 BCE, which the geniuses on Ancient Aliens misread as 15,000 BCE, adding an extra 2,000 years onto Poznański's already flawed dates. Here's what he did wrong. Poznański assumed that the Kala Sasaya temple at Tiwanaku was laid out with perfect accuracy to align to the equinoxes and solstices that he felt but could not prove were important to the Tiwanaku people. Thus, on a certain day, the sun was supposed to rise above one rock at the temple and set behind another. Ah, but which rock should we choose? Since the current ruins do not align with these celestial events accurately, he concluded that the ruins must have been built at a time when they would have aligned with that event. Since the sun and sky change positions at a predictable rate due to the gradual changes in the angle of the Earth's axis, he concluded that the Kala Sasaya temple was built in 13,000 BCE as a solar observatory, despite no other evidence of solar astronomy at the site. The long and the short of it is that Poznański assumed celestial alignments and assumed flawless construction, and then used his assumptions to prove that his assumptions were correct. Colavito also has this picture of the site with the caption, "Pick a rock, any rock, one of them must align with something." This site has been dated using a huge variety of methods, things like carbon dating, the type of metals they used, the debris found in certain places, the type of iconography they used. Literally every kind of dating method applied comes to the same conclusion. It was constructed in the early Middle Ages. Before we conclude this section on Pumapunku, there are two other claims I wanted to address.
The Spanish conqueror asked the Inca, the people living there, including the king of the Inca, "What is this Pumapunku?" And they all said, "It's not us. It's not our forefather who make this. This were made by the gods in one single night." Usually a king is proud about what his people did, about the precision and so on. In that case, the chief and the people said, "No, it was not us. It was the gods who made it."
If you understand a little about the Incan imperial system and religion, you will understand why the Incans didn't claim the site, and even why they claimed that it had a supernatural origin. Part of the Incan state religion was that the Incan Empire was the first civilization, and it was created by God himself. It was a very convenient idea for bolstering the Incan case for the right to rule everyone else. When the Incans arrived at Pumapunku, the site had already been abandoned for at least 100 years. Admitting that there was a pre-Incan culture at all, let alone one with more skill than them, would have been detrimental to the whole scheme. So they slightly modified their already existing mythology to include Pumapunku. So instead of Viracocha creating the Incan capital, he also created Pumapunku. And just like that, the Incans were still the oldest and greatest civilization, even though everyone probably knew it wasn't true. And finally, Ancient Aliens says the following about what the ancient local people believed regarding who constructed Pumapunku.
Local legends suggest that Tiahuanaco was built as a site of religious pilgrimage to celebrate the arrival of sky gods.
But this is a total lie. Viracocha came from the sea, not from the sky. This is a very sneaky move by Ancient Aliens, in my opinion. So, in conclusion, the stones are not made of granite and diorite. The stones were easily workable with the tools available to the Andean culture, tools which we know included high-quality metal alloyed chisels. These tools would have been more than sufficient to make the angles seen at Pumapunku. The faces of the rocks have been finished using a polishing technique after being rough cut using stone hammers, evidenced by the unfinished stones and hidden areas of the finished stones. The moving of the stones was not as difficult as Ancient Aliens makes it seem, especially when you take into account that they are telling people that the stones weigh 600 tons more than they actually do. The stones have telltale drag marks and hoisting holes for ropes, all showing that they were not levitated as Ancient Aliens would have us believe. We know the culture which built this monument, and all the iconography and sculptures are consistent with that culture, and the various methods of dating that scientists use all point to the same time period. The idea that Pumapunku was from Atlantean times we now know is based on a very transparently flawed presupposition.
Eastern Lebanon, the Bekaa Valley. Here, at this archaeological site, stand the ruins of Heliopolis, built in the 4th century BC by Alexander the Great to honor Zeus. But beneath the Corinthian columns and remnants of both Greek and Roman architecture lie the ruins of a site that is much, much older. According to archaeologists, it dates back nearly 9,000 years. The ancient city of Baalbek, named after the early Canaanite deity Baal.
And so because it was already sacred to the god Baal, then later the Greeks and the Romans then would build temples on this very same spot.
Archaeological surveys have revealed that the enormous stone foundation that lies at the base of the site dates back tens of thousands of years. But even more significant to ancient astronaut theorists is their belief that the colossal stone platform may once have served as a landing pad for space travelers.
The idea that Ancient Aliens will try to convey is that underneath the Roman ruins lies a very old platform that was once used to launch spacecraft. As we watch the next clip, listen for the first thing they cite as evidence for this claim.
Well, what was originally there before the Roman temple was this spaceport platform that was apparently used for extraterrestrials coming and going on planet Earth.
As evidence, researchers point to the gigantic megalithic stones incorporated into the foundation, each weighing between 800 to 1,200 tons, and perfectly fitted together.
These three stones they're referring to are called the trilithons, and the heaviest of the three is 800 tons, not 1,200 tons as they say. There are two other stones that are heavier than this around the area, but they are unused, still connected to the bedrock in the quarries, and thus are obviously not part of the trilithons. The way the information is presented about these three stones leads the viewer to believe that they are part of the foundation, or platform, of the Baalbek site. What they want the viewer to think is that spacecraft lifted off and landed on the stones of this platform. They also claim that these three stones cannot be of Roman construction, as the mainstream archaeologists believe, but they say that they were part of the earliest structure at the Baalbek site, and that the Greeks and Romans only built on top of this ancient foundation. And it is true that there was a very old pre-Roman temple at this site, but we will learn more about that later. Our focus at the moment is the trilithon stones. Ancient Alien says that these three stones are the real mystery of Baalbek.
This is the real mystery of Baalbek, how these stones came to be there, why they were placed there, and specifically how they were transported into place, because some of the stones are of such magnitude that modern machinery is incapable of putting them there, but somehow our ancestors were able to do this.
To solve this mystery, we need to first understand that these three stones do not form the foundation of Baalbek, as is so often suggested. The trilithon stones lay end to end, or long ways, and are part of the narrow wall on the western end of the complex. They are most certainly not the foundation, nor do they constitute a platform, and it would be very awkward for a spaceship to land on top of them, considering the space on top is so narrow. Ancient Aliens tries to make it seem like no one knows the purpose for these stones, or why they had to be so heavy.
But if the moving, hoisting, and setting of such massive stones was so incredibly difficult, then who, or what, placed them there? And perhaps more importantly, why?
The truth is that the purpose for this wall is very well known by archaeologists. It was a retaining wall. Retaining wall technology really improved with the Greeks because of the importance of the amphitheater in their culture. Because most amphitheaters were sunken into the ground and surrounded by earth, they needed to construct retaining walls to hold back the soil. Then the Romans came along and basically perfected the practice. The rule of thumb in retaining walls, even today, is the bigger and heavier the stones, the better the retaining wall. Also, the stones needed to be in as big of sections as possible. In other words, huge sections of uncut stone. It's no coincidence that some of the biggest single stones in the ancient world, besides Baalbek, are also used in retaining walls, and by the Romans as well, as we will see. Retaining walls were especially important if there was a lot of soil erosion at the site, or if the platform you were trying to build was on a steep incline. At Baalbek, the platform was built right on the side of a huge hill, so for that reason alone, it would require a retaining wall if they intended to make a large level platform. But if you added to that a soil erosion problem, you would have two very good reasons for a huge retaining wall at Baalbek. So, does the area around Baalbek have a problem with soil erosion? The answer is yes, probably one of the biggest in the world. You can see evidence of soil erosion all around the Baalbek site. The soil from the top of the hill has been sliding down the hill into the valley below for hundreds of years. One of the leading causes of soil erosion is deforestation. If an area that once had trees has been completely cleared of those trees, the rain no longer will have anything to slow down its velocity. Normally, the rain hits tree branches and the thick foliage that accumulates on the forest floor over time. Also, the soil is kept in check by the root systems of the trees, which hold the soil in place. Lebanon has a picture of a cedar tree on its flag. Their trees have been a symbol of pride for literally millennia, the so-called cedars of Lebanon. But the forests have disappeared long ago, as they were one of the only sites for timber in the ancient Near East, and it was massively deforested in ancient times. In fact, the soil shifting is just as bad today in the Bekaa Valley. The UN in 2006 proposed a series of solutions to deal with this now full-scale environmental disaster in the Baalbek region. Homes in the region are being abandoned as their foundations shift and they become inhabitable. But although these proposed solutions by the UN may be new, this problem is an ancient one the Romans would have been well aware of. The massive trilithon stones provided the weight needed to press down and secure the stones in the wall below. This is why you only see these huge stones on one side of Baalbek, the side where the steep slope is. The idea that these stones were part of a platform and were used as a landing pad is something that requires ignorance of the layout of the site in order to believe. Well, what about the age of this wall? Is it from the Roman period of construction, or is it from the pre-Roman Canaanite era? There is a lot of confusion about this point because there was indeed a very old pre-Roman temple on this site. The pre-Roman Canaanite temple was a pretty standard platform and altar, much like other sites built by the Canaanites, which were referred to in the Old Testament as high places. The original site was probably chosen by the Canaanites because it was indeed on a hill, as any good high place should be, but also because it was less than half a mile from the perfect stone quarry. The early versions of this temple, however, did not have a retaining wall. As the different groups added to the site over the years, the site changed drastically. The Romans alone spent 200 years doing construction at the site. Think of that. That would be like starting a construction project in 1812 that only just now came to completion. That's a long time to be working on a project. So yes, Baalbek is built on a very old Canaanite altar to Baal, but the trilithon stones were not part of that site, nor are they part of the foundation as is often claimed. They are part of a very necessary retaining wall. The question still remains, however, about the methods for moving and lifting these stones.
Some have suggested that this stone alone weighs in excess of 1,200 tons. How was it moved there? Because obviously it's situated on top of these stone rows that we can find down here, which means that this stone had to be lifted and then set on top of these stones down here.
So did the Romans have the technology to move and lift such stones? Well, all you have to do is look one country over to find out. About the same time the Romans were beginning their 200-year project at Baalbek, another project of similar magnitude was beginning by the Roman client king Herod the Great in 19 BC. Herod, using Roman techniques, renovated the Temple Mount to earn favor with the Jews, who viewed him as a Roman proxy, not a Jew. The expanded version of the temple was double the size of the original, but in order to make this expansion, he had to incorporate part of the hill to the northeast, which meant that he had to construct a massive retaining wall in order to hold back the force of the earth in order to build the massive platform. There is a portion of this retaining wall still standing today, and it contains the second largest set of single stones next to Baalbek. Just like Baalbek, there are several of these stones lined up to form the wall and to provide the weight and size needed to hold back the earth. They call the four largest stones the master course. The weight of the heaviest one is 630 tons, only a little over 100 tons less than Baalbek's biggest stone. And no one denies that these stones were cut, moved, and lifted to perfection using Roman and local techniques. As a side note, it's tempting to think that the holes visible in these stones were used for lifting, but these holes were cut after the stones were placed. They were used to hold plaster in place for certain water projects and only go a few inches deep. Anyway, is it really logical to believe that the Romans could cut, move, and lift 630-ton blocks for retaining walls just fine, but if you added another 100 tons, it would require alien technology? We know that the Romans, about this same time, had taken a liking to Egyptian obelisks. They started dragging these obelisks back to Rome in large numbers, and Rome was hundreds of miles by land and sea from Egypt, whereas Baalbek was less than a mile from the quarry. Some of these obelisks were almost 500 tons, so the Romans had a lot of opportunities to get good at moving stones about the same size and shape of the trilithon stones. There are even Roman descriptions of the process of moving obelisks by Marcellinus Comus, as well as reliefs such as the one on the bottom of the Theodosius obelisk in Istanbul. The ancient Roman writings of Marcus Vitruvius Pollio describe in detail many of the Roman technological advantages, like pulleys, which would reduce the force needed by half for each pulley used. He even described their ingenious way of moving stones by constructing huge oak wheels on either end of the block, whether they were round like pillars or huge rectangular stones like the trilithons. They would then be pulled by oxen to the site. So what about the lifting of the trilithon stones at Baalbek? Some make the point that the trilithon stones do not have Lewis holes in them like many of the other Roman stones at Baalbek. Lewis holes is the name for the holes that the Romans would drill in the stones for lifting with their cranes. Yes, the Romans had cranes, and although their cranes only had a 5-ton capacity, often they would combine many of them together, which would obviously give them a greater capacity. So why don't these 3 stones contain these holes, like all the rest of the stones at Baalbek? Well, first of all, I wouldn't be so sure that they don't. No one has ever seen what is on the ends of these stones. It may very well be that they decided against a straight-up or dead lift of the trilithon stones because of their weight, and instead decided to lift up only one side of the stone. You would really only need to lift it high enough and long enough to get even the smallest brace underneath it, because at that point you would have a number of mechanical advantages and therefore options. For example, watch as this man makes a Stonehenge in his backyard all by himself using a simple counterweight method.
I've tried to do this without any mechanical machinery at all. I've used mostly sticks and stones for my equipment. No pulleys, no hoist, no metal levers. Just try to use gravity too, I believe is my favorite tool. Whoop.
The first goal is getting this block 3 feet off the ground.
In order to move it up to this point, I just rock the block back and forth, adding weight to that end, and that opens a gap on this side, and just slide a board in. Then I add the weight to that end, there she goes, and slide a board in on this end.
This shoring box acts like a jack, slowly raising the block.
But it's not really even necessary for them to have been lifted. A French paper written by Jean-Pierre Adam meticulously details how the stones could have been moved using the specifications provided by Marcus Vitruvius Pollio by constructing roads underneath the stones on rollers, and the roads were raised to lead to the exact place of their placement, which was easy at Baalbek because of the terrain, so it wouldn't require any lifting, and then using man-powered drums and a system of capstans to pull the stones along the road. This method would have only required 144 workers to accomplish. It's also helpful for people to remember that the largest stone ever moved in the world is the so-called Thunderstone in Russia. Moved in the 1700s using no modern equipment, this stone is 1.5 tons larger than the largest trilithon stone. And we know that moving it didn't require any alien technology. Well, what about this claim?
What's really interesting about Baalbek is it's always been known as the landing place. There's an actual text from Sumerian times called the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh actually claims to have seen rockets descend and ascend from Baalbek, the landing place.
These claims come directly from the writings of Zechariah Sitchin, and they are totally untrue. Baalbek was not called the landing place, and the Epic of Gilgamesh never speaks of rockets ascending and descending anywhere in it.
If you're going to make these assertions, okay, I would want the passage. I want to see the passage in Gilgamesh that names Baalbek specifically. Okay, I'm naturally skeptical that there is such a passage, but if you're going to make this claim, you have to be able to establish with certainty, not even just a general region. You have to establish with certainty that these are the stones, or that these stones are what is being referred to in any given text.
Sitchin, when making this claim in his book, never tells the reader where they can find this in the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is probably because it makes it harder for the reader to check his facts.
Yeah, I have personally found the writings of Sitchin very frustrating from the perspective of a scholar and an academic, which is what I am. It's sort of reflexively what I look for. It's very hard to follow his trail because he just doesn't cite sources. Even if he cites a source, for instance, an ancient text, he doesn't give you sort of the chapter and verse. He doesn't give you the tablet numbers, the line numbers. And I have to look at it and say, it's either really lazy or he doesn't want you to be able to check up on him. It's one or the other.
I will link the actual section of the Epic as well as a link to the online resources to check the Sumerian text for yourselves at the website ancientaliensdebunked.com. Nowadays, all the Sumerian tablets, including their own dictionaries, are searchable online. Yes, the Sumerians wrote their own extensive and detailed dictionaries, so we don't have to trust Sitchin or anyone else. We can basically just ask the Sumerians what they thought a word meant. And it becomes painfully obvious to anyone that cares enough to look that Sitchin was at best totally incompetent as a translator, and at worst a scam artist. See SitchinIsWrong.com to begin your journey in losing any confidence in the so-called translations of Zechariah Sitchin. In conclusion, the trilithon stones are part of a necessary retaining wall, not a foundation, and such walls were common to the Greeks and Romans. The retaining wall was not part of the simple, original, much smaller temple at Baalbek, and we know from other retaining walls of similar size, built by the Romans at the same time and in the same area, that they were more than capable of moving and placing stones of that size and shape, also evidenced by their ability to move obelisks. This is especially true if you gave them over 200 years in which to do it.
Arguably, the most remarkable Mayan artifact ever found, the stone sarcophagus lid of King Pakal, has produced considerable controversy. Mainstream scholars believe the depiction is of King Pakal on a journey to the underworld. But ancient astronaut theorists believe the king is portrayed seated at the controls of a spacecraft and have dubbed him the Palenque astronaut.
He appears to be going into space. He's the original rocket man. There, manipulating his spacecraft, going into space.
We have maintained for a very long time that the depiction here is of King Pakal sitting in some type of a spacecraft, because he is at an angle like modern day astronauts upon liftoff. He's manipulating some controls right here. He has some type of a breathing apparatus or some type of a telescope in front of his face. His feet are on some type of a pedal. And down here, you have something that looks like an exhaust with flames.
The sarcophagus lid of Pakal has been a centerpiece for the ancient astronaut theories since the beginning. Eric von Däniken believes this to be one of his best pieces of evidence.
And you see his upper hand, he's manipulating some controls. From the lower hand, he's turning something on. The heel of his left foot is on a kind of pedal. And outside of the capsule, you see a linking flame. This is incredible. This is absolutely a proof for extraterrestrials.
The theory rests on the idea that the Mayans were not depicting their usual symbols here, but were trying to realistically depict a rocket with Pakal as its pilot. I think the best thing I can do for you here is to clearly explain what the Mayanists and other scientists who specialize in Mayan culture and artwork believe this scene is depicting. As Ancient Alien said, archaeologists believe this scene is depicting the moment of Pakal's death and his descent into the underworld. Let me show you why they believe that. The most famous symbol in this picture is that of the World Tree, which, if you believe Ancient Aliens, would make up the entire hull of the rocket. It's hard to overemphasize the importance of the World Tree in Mayan mythology. The idea was that the World Tree extended into the heavens with its branches, and its roots extended into the underworld, so it was a symbol of the bridge between the underworld, heaven, and earth. When it is depicted, it almost always has the double-headed vision serpent on its branches, just like it is depicted here on Pakal's lid. The vision serpent was believed to live at the center of the world. Thus, it is depicted just above the underworld and just below the heavens. In its top branches is the celestial bird, which is seen a little more clearly in other World Tree depictions like this one, but on Pakal's lid you can see it's clearly depicting the same bird. The celestial bird represented the heavens, and thus was pictured on top of the World Tree. What Ancient Alien says is the exhaust or fire from the rocket's takeoff is the roots of the World Tree extending into the underworld, which is not just typical for the depictions of the World Tree, it's pretty much a requirement. In the underworld, we see a picture of the Mayan sun monster, which Pakal is riding into the underworld. The idea was that every time the sun set, it was actually traveling into the underworld, where it would die, like everything else in the underworld. You can even see the bottom half of the sun's face was a skeleton, while the top half still had flesh and had not yet died. This too is a common theme showing the moment of transition. So Pakal is hitching a ride on the sun into the underworld. Even the so-called smoke is easily explained when you understand Mayan symbols. In Mayan art, whenever you see a so-called traveler, which is a person in transition from one world to the next, there must be something that is making that travel possible. Sometimes it's a twisted umbilical cord, but almost always it's a serpent, often a double-headed serpent. In other words, being in the mouths of double-headed serpents was a symbol of transition from one world to the next. You can see that the so-called smoke is actually the traditional serpent's beard, which appears on almost every depiction of a serpent in Mayan art. Now that you have an idea about what the scholars believe about this, let's look at some of Ancient Alien's specific claims.
He's manipulating some controls right here.
They say his hands are manipulating some controls, but if you look closely, his right hand isn't touching anything at all, and the thing to its right is not connected to the tree any more than any of the other floating design elements in the picture. His left hand could be said to be manipulating controls more than his right, but you would have to say that all these marks on the tree are controls too, which in reality is probably the bark of the world tree, which was modeled after the ceiba tree, which had a very unique bark and thus was usually depicted in some way or another in world tree art. The odd position of Pakal's hands in this image is really what all the fuss is about. In the 1970s video refutation of the ancient astronaut theories, the Mayan expert in that film made the point that the hands in Mayan art are often depicted in delicate positions.
The Maya like to show hands in rather delicate gestures.
Such gestures are common in Mayan art. There are similar examples on the side of the slab.
As far as the claim about his foot being on a type of pedal, I would have to say that if that is how aliens design pedals, then we are far more advanced in pedal technology than they are, because that may be the worst angle to put any kind of foot pedal. Plus, there are other reliefs of Mayans in the underworld on similar slabs with their feet in similar positions, but without the rocket. Well, what about this so-called breathing tube for his nose? Well, it doesn't connect to anything. And if you look closely, the thing it could potentially connect to is also represented on the other side of the lid, and is clearly a stylistic element of the vision serpent. What it actually is a nose piercing, particularly a bone.
Here, an earring suspended from a pierced ear, a nose plug, which has the elements of death because it takes the form of a fleshless bone.
Finally, consider the context that we find this image. It's on a coffin lid, so the mainstream view is perfectly in line with that, and the whole concept was common in Mayan burials. It would have been a strange thing for them to all of a sudden abandon their usual symbolic artwork to depict a rocket on a coffin lid. The fact is that the symbols on the sarcophagus lid are really consistently used. Often the symbols are even explained in the extensive Mayan writings. These symbols fit perfectly with what we know about their beliefs about the world and the afterlife. We will look at Incan megalithic sites like Machu Picchu all in one segment, because Incan stonemasonry was all done more or less the same way. In regard to Incan building, Ancient Aliens focuses most of its attention on the curved or beveled edges of the stones. They say that it looks like the edges of these stones were melted. Notice as we listen to them build the case for this, that the reason they believe this is true is based entirely on the way the stones look.
There are signs in many of these stones that show very large amounts of thermal heat have been applied to mold the stones in such a way that they fit perfectly. And so it really does raise a lot of questions.
If you look at the style the Sacsayhuaman wall was built, the blocks look as if they've been molded like putty. If you can mold stone into place, then all of a sudden, as crazy as this sounds, it makes more sense.
Now, melting granite or any other stone and reshaping it would leave unmistakable evidence in and on the stones themselves. In other words, if the rocks were melted, it would be easily provable. It would not be a matter of what the stones look like. It would be a simple yes or no question. Ancient Aliens skips this step of proving or disproving their theory. Instead, they assume that the rocks were melted based on the look of the stones and move on to the step of trying to figure out who would have the technology to melt stones.
I have a stone torch, which I use for sometimes shaping granite. And I mean, it generates a temperature of in excess of 3,000 degrees. 3,000 degrees. That's a lot.
When we look back at the ancients And we see a technology that they couldn't possibly know. There's only two possibilities of that. Either God did it, which we really don't think happened, or some high-tech civilization from another planet came and showed them how to do it. Then took their materials and tools and went back home.
I think there's at least one more possibility that Mr. Dunn may have missed. Every shaped stone at any Incan site has what archaeologists call pit marks or pit scars. They occur when stone hammers are used to quarry and shape the stone. In addition, archaeologists have found a huge number of Incan stone hammers at the quarries. And, almost uniquely to the Incans, they are found at the building sites too. Because the Incans only rough cut the stones at the quarries. They did the finish work on site, so the stones would perfectly fit the stones around them. Well, how did the Incans accomplish these beveled edges? They used a smaller gauge stone hammer for the outer section. The evidence for this can be seen on every single stone that has these edges. You can see that the pit scars are much more numerous and smaller on the edges, showing that more blows with a smaller stone was used to achieve the detail work. Another reason that this is no mystery to archaeologists is because there are a large number of stones in various stages of construction in the ancient Incan quarries. These stones reveal that indeed the Incan stonemasons were using some of the most basic tools, even for their time. If you would like to learn more about the details of this, I'll link you to some peer-reviewed papers that can tell you more than you'd ever want to know, including details of experiments done. For example, a single scientist in 90 minutes accomplished similar cuts with similar tools. And all of this makes what Dunn says here one of the most off-the-wall things ever said in the Ancient Aliens series.
I can't help but think that whoever was behind this thought the process through from beginning to end. They didn't quarry the rock and then decide, how the heck are we going to transport this? They knew from beginning to end what needed to be done with whatever techniques and technology they were going to use. In industry today, there's a kind of an adage, keep it simple, stupid.
Based on his experience, Mike Dunn believes the simplest way to build the Great Walls of Machu Picchu would have been to transport small rocks to the site, then melt them, and use molds to fashion the exact size and shape needed.
So he says it's more simple to melt the granite, something so complicated that we don't really even know how to do it today. Is that really the most simple solution he could come up with? And then to say that they poured the melted rocks into a mold. I mean, look at these walls. Can anyone look at this and say, yeah, that looks like they were made from the same mold? These are not exactly bricks of the same size and shape, unless he wants to say that they made a new mold for every block, in which case we would go well out of the range of this being the most simple solution. As far as how the Incans moved the stones into place, they left us a lot of evidence behind in the form of ramps. There are Incan ramps all over the place, still in existence today, in the quarries and at the building sites. The Incans had one of the most massive workforces in all the ancient world. They were like the Roman Empire of the West, and they had an absolutely huge labor force at the ready for these types of projects. So we know these rocks were not melted and put into molds as Ancient Aliens tells us. We actually know exactly how they made these rounded edges, because of the pit marks left behind, as well as the huge number of stone hammers found in the quarries. There are no mysteries that require alien input with Incan stonework.
Early in the 20th century, tomb robbers searching along the Magdalena River stumbled upon a gravesite dating back 1,500 years to a pre-Columbian civilization known as the Tolima. Among the funerary objects found there were hundreds of small 2 to 3 inch gold figurines.
Many of those looked like insects and fish. However, out of those hundreds that they found, they also found about a dozen that are eerily reminiscent of modern-day fighter jets.
Okay, so he admits that when these things were found, there were hundreds of them that were clearly representing insects and animals, and only about 10 of them that looked like jet airplanes.
Now, before we get into the specifics, I would like to appeal to your sense of logic. Almost all of these little figurines are depicting fish, birds, insects, lizards, and frogs. And we can see when we look at the figurines where we know what they're trying to depict, like these frogs for instance, we can see a huge amount of variation and clearly stylistic elements that are not found in nature. So we know that they weren't trying to be ultra-realistic here, which you can further see by looking at their depictions of this man, or this cat, or this alligator. The Tolima were artists, and like most artists, they had a certain style that they brought to the subjects that they were depicting. Now, considering that all the other objects they found are animals, and considering the objects in question, like all the others, have eyes and teeth and so on, isn't it more logical to assume that these objects are probably like all the others? That is, that they are also depicting some kind of animal in a stylized way? Ah, but wait, Ancient Aliens has a false dilemma for us.
And they have nothing in common with anything similar in nature.
There is not a single insect in the world which has got its wings at the bottom. Now, when you exclude the possibility that it's an insect, one of the things which remain is the fact that this is actually, yes, what it looks like, a plane.
Okay, let's see if we have this logic straight. Since no insect has these characteristics, it leaves us with only one other choice, which is an airplane. But I thought there were fish, birds, lizards, bats, and cats found too in the other 100 figurines. It would seem to me that he's kind of skipping a few options here on his way to the airplane conclusion. Let's take the most famous one, for example. This is the one that we will see later that they made a model airplane out of. The tails of all these figurines are vertical, which would make me think of fish, which also have vertical tails. One fish that the Tolima would have been familiar with is the suckermouth catfish. This might explain the round head and the big eyes, and even the small protrusions on the front of the fins. You can see that some varieties of this species of catfish have small protrusions on the front of its fins as well. When you look at the other gold figurines, you can see that not only were fish a common subject, but many different species of fish were represented. Because of the number and placement of the fins, fish are proposed for some of the other figurines as well. So when he says that no insect has its wings on the bottom, so it must be an airplane, I can only see that as deceptive, considering the placement and angle of the fins are perfectly accounted for in many fish species that were available and important to the Tolima culture. In other words, airplanes don't have a monopoly on being aerodynamic. To prove one of these figurines was aerodynamic, which according to Ancient Aliens proves it was a plane, they built a model of it. Here is what they say about it.
It was rather simple because we don't need to put much parts to this shape because this shape is perfect. Everything was already done by the native people 2,000 years ago.
They did not add an inch or remove an inch. They just essentially blew the little thing into a larger size. I mean, this is sensational.
No, they didn't add an inch or remove an inch, unless you count things like totally removing the big curls on the front of the wings, which would have rendered the model totally useless for flying. They also added curvature to the wings. They added flaps, a landing gear, and one more little thing, a propeller and an engine. Finally, I want to appeal to your sense of logic on the following point. Consider that all we know about this culture reveals them to be simple farmers, fishermen, and artisans, people that lived off the land. And considering that there is nothing in the extensive amount of archaeological material from this culture that would suggest knowledge about planes landing and taking off all the time, is it logical to assume that aliens landing and taking off in their backyards made so little impression on them that they only devote 10 of the hundreds of figurines to it and only in one tomb? Or is it more logical to assume that just like the other hundreds of figurines with eyes and teeth and fins, that they are highly stylized animals, like fish, that they knew about and relied upon in their daily lives? I think even a die-hard ancient astronaut theorist would have to admit that logic is not on their side on this one. Many people are familiar with these images of stone heads, called moai by the locals. Ancient Aliens tells us that nothing is really known about them.
How in the heck did they make these? Where did they come from? And how did they move them? Nobody has the answer.
This isn't true at all. For instance, we know exactly how they were cut and shaped, because the construction of the moai was abandoned abruptly. So there are plenty of examples of moai in various stages of development. Also, the stone tools that they used to pound out the relatively soft volcanic rock were found all over the quarries. Here's a clip of one of the locals explaining to his grandson how the moai were built.
He thinks that 20 people carved this moai over a period of time of 5 to 6 years to this stage. This is our sections of people who were, given as your assignment. This is your section. You can carve, and you can see different, ways of doing it, and you can clearly see the talkie marks and how the people were carving and going in and make these deep cuts in the rock like this, that.
The channels reached around and eventually formed a boat-like keel until the statue could be snapped off and fully extracted.
Ancient Aliens spends most of its time here discussing the moving of the moai, and it's interesting the angle that they take, because it seems that they are aware that there have been many successful experiments moving moai with wooden sleds and minimal workers. So, Ancient Aliens has to do what they do best, create a false dilemma.
But there is a unique problem with the idea of moving moai with sleds or rollers.
When you go to Easter Island, you don't get the impression they had enough wood to have rollers. And in fact, in the 1700s, the first 4 expeditions to Easter Island never really saw a tree. And so that's the real mystery of Easter Island. How can you move a multi-ton statue if you have no trees for rollers?
So, they say there are currently no trees on Easter Island. Therefore, they assume there were never any trees on Easter Island, and therefore, well, aliens. The problem with this is that there used to be a lot of trees on Easter Island, which we now know because of extensive pollen samples taken from the crater lakes as well as other methods. In fact, the very reason there are no trees on Easter Island now is probably because they used all of them while moving and lifting over 1,000 moais over hundreds of years. In other words, they used all the trees. One interesting thing about Easter Island is regarding soil erosion. If you take a land that once had a lot of trees and cut them all down, then you will have a massive soil erosion problem. This is because there would be no more root systems to hold the soil in place. Also, the rains no longer have anything to stop their velocity. The soil erosion at Easter Island is so notorious that if you type soil erosion into a search engine, you will see that the Wikipedia page has a picture of Easter Island. Some of the moai actually have full bodies, they're not just heads, but because of soil erosion, even in a very short time, they have been covered up to their necks in soil. This is a direct result of the land being completely deforested. So we know for sure how these moai were cut and shaped. That is, with simple tools which are found all over the quarries. And we know that if they had trees on Easter Island, then there are no problems with moving them and prying them into place. And Easter Island used to have a lot of trees before their fascination with creating moai exhausted their supply.